Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, we're going to be talking about comic studies, grief, memory, and how all that can be combined into a pretty special piece of creative nonfiction. Joining me on this 4-episode series, which is brought to you with generous support from the Wilfrid Laurier University Press, is Dr. Dale Jacobs, a professor of English at the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, and the author of several books, including his latest, On Comics and Grief. The title is a hybrid of scholarship, memoir, nostalgia, and grief over the recent death of the author's mother. It's an encapsulation of how researchers are allowing personal experiences to inform their scholarship and guide the ways in which it is presented. In this final episode of our 4-part series, Dale and I continue our conversation about how his personal experience and family history informed his book, including how he tied things up in his epilogue. Lastly, Dale provides some outlook on what areas of comic studies are still in need of further investigation. When you completed your manuscript, one of your peer reviewers made a suggestion that had an impact on you, and of course you included it in your book. Um, can you describe what they said, how you reacted, and how you ended up concluding the book?
Yeah, that was Anna Papard who wrote that, who's a Canadian comic scholar. And she was very insightful. The book ends on a very bleak note. It ends with a short section of creative nonfiction back to the time of Mom's death. So back to basically where I was at the beginning of the book in the introduction, where I'm standing in front of a newsstand, but there aren't any comics on it anymore because that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very bleak and not hopeful image. And that really reflected where I was because Heidi's mother had passed away in 2018. My dissertation director passed away a year after that, and that hit me very hard. I was very close to her. One of the cats we'd had for a long time passed away. So it just felt like it was this palimpsest of grief. And I was quite burned out at the time. And so that's how it came out. And so Anna wrote, it's a very harsh ending for the book. It's not showing that this has been a way to think through grief. Is there any way you can show some hope? And I thought through what she was saying, and she was right. She's absolutely right. And at the same time, I got response from series editors saying, have you thought about writing an epilogue? Which I was initially a bit resistant to, but then I realized they're right. And so I thought that's where I need to address what Anna's saying. And in keeping with what I'm doing in the book, I want to include, peer review is usually hidden, that readers won't see that response. Right. And I thought, no, I'm going to, with Anna's permission and with Siobhan's blessing at the press, I want to include it. And that's another sort of strategy to think about academic writing differently. It calls attention to the revision process. It calls attention to the conversation that we have, that at its best, peer review lets us see things we wouldn't see. We always joke about, the second reader, second reviewer gives these terrible comments, but that's often not true. It's material that's useful if we're going to open ourselves to thinking about it. So she was right. I wanted to include what she said. So that is at the beginning of the epilogue. And then I get into, sort of what happened after and how I started to come out of burnout and things started to feel better. I started to realize the ways in which this really had been an exercise partially in dealing with my grief. I mean, one of the ways people ask about writing this book, and I say it's both the best thing I've ever done and the absolute hardest thing I've ever done, writing this book. And it also, for me, is I couldn't speak at Mom's funeral. This is me doing that.
Right. So, I don't want to harp on the grief too much, but it is, an integral part of the
Mm-hmm.
book, as you've said. And you say in the epilogue, and I quote, "Grief is, in the most basic sense, why I needed to write this book." So I'm just wondering if grief was the need, then was the scholarship kind of the want? I mean, can you talk about why you foregrounded that grief over, maybe not over the scholarship, but you know, combined it with the scholarship? And you know, was that something you realized sort of after the book was finished? I mean, or did you sort of go into it intentionally that way?
I went into it intentionally that way.
Yeah, yeah,
Once I realized that really I chose 1976 because of Mom, because I
mm,
was 10 at the time. Once I realized that, and realized that this project is about her in some sense, uh, then I thought it needs to be about both grief. Well, it needs to be about grief. It needs to be about Mom. It needs to be about the comics.
yeah,
So I think grief was the need. The scholarship was the want, because I had been wanting to write a book about this for so long. I couldn't figure out how to do it.
yeah.
Nothing felt sustainable as a project. Nothing felt like something I wanted to continue to work on. But when I realized that it's about Mom, it wasn't something that I just wanted to work on. It was something I had to work on.
Hmm. Okay.
And I think that's the difference. Um, but it's also, I say several times in the book, this isn't an extraordinary grief. Everyone goes through this.
Yeah. Right.
And I wanted to write this to show people that it's okay to let our emotions and what's happening in our lives become part of our scholarship, that we won't have to bury that all the time. So I think all those things have always been swirling around in my head.
Hmm. Do you think you've sort of exercised this entire process, or do you feel like you'll come back to it in future scholarship?
I don't think I'll come back to grief.
Yeah.
Um, I think I've said what I needed to say.
Yeah.
Um, and, I've always said I wrote 100 miles for Dad, and I wrote this book for Mom. So, I mean, I sort of think that's enough. I don't really have anything else to say. I mean,
Right.
I just imagine what she'd say to see her picture on the cover, sorry, of
It's
an
okay.
academic book.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
So there's a certain Klaus that came into your lives
Klaus,
at an important time that you
yeah,
talk about in the epilogue. Can you talk about Klaus?
Klaus is a cat. Um, he's he's kind of famous amongst our friends, but also a little bit internet famous because of his story. My wife Heidi, who's a writer, has actually written a children's book about Klaus.
Oh, wow.
Um, and he just showed up in the spring of 2019 in our backyard, along with a gray cat we called Sebastian, just strays. And Sebastian kind of brought him in, and we started feeding him. And so he started living in our backyard. He lived in our backyard for 2 years. He's clearly lost. He's fixed, and he has no front claws. So he was
Mm,
living outside with no front claws. He's living in our backyard. He's just the loveliest little cat. And then we'd had I mentioned before, a lot of deaths, and so one summer Heidi wanted to get a kitten, sort of to bring some life into the house. And Nora, she died. And the vet said this is the exact term, failure to thrive. So she died as a very tiny kitten, and we were just devastated. And Klaus was still living outside, and then something happened with him. We think a groundhog bit his tail, and he disappeared, and we were just beside ourselves. And he was gone for about a week, and then he came back, and we sort of opened the door, and he came in and checked it out. And then the next day he came in, and he's never left, and he has no interest in being outside. And he really has, kind of, it sounds corny, but helped me with just being around. And like when I was so burned out, and he's been here, and he's this really quiet, nice presence in the house. And Klaus was one of the things Anna knew about Klaus, and she mentioned, talk about Klaus. And so I did. So he's now in an academic book.
There you go. That's not corny at all. I mean, that's, pets will have that impact on us. So, looking at just the general scholarship on comics, what areas or subjects do you still feel are untapped?
I think that there still needs to more work done on typical comics, on, the comics everybody was reading. And again, I understand why people want to focus on the outstanding comics and the exemplary examples and all that. But I think there's a lot to be gained from looking at the comics that were seen as throwaways. Yeah. And it's interesting because what academics study and what gets collected by comics collectors and what the same things get disregarded by both. Kids comics, for example. Lots of people study superhero comics, and of course collectors, but kids comics, romance comics, there's not much done. War comics, there's not much done. I think thanks to, I mentioned before, Bart Beatty's book, we've got a little bit of work on Archie. But typical comics, I think, are part of it. Barbara Postma, in her book, has this line that's always stuck with me: style signifies. And while we sometimes talk about artistic style, that idea about how style signifies and what is there makes sense to me. And for me, that's also coming from my background in rhetoric, where style is important. Style is one of the canons. And so I think a lot about style with comics, and I think that's something that needs to be talked about. And then just two other quick things. I think a book history approach is really useful, and I hope introducing it here will lead other people to follow that up and use book history as a methodology.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is just that idea that we don't have to excise the personal from our scholarship. That's for me a lot of what this book is, and pulling away that curtain and just in general challenging what academic work has to look like.
Right. Excellent. Well, Dale, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Great. Thanks very much.
You just heard from Dr. Dale Jacobs, an English professor at the University of Windsor and author of the recent book on comics and grief. This episode was brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.